All right, welcome back to class. This is Introduction to American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking a little bit about sort of the basic ideas of constitutional protections, the idea of civil liberties, civil rights. Now we're going to move on to the idea of public opinion, which is really important for understanding how a democracy works. Politicians can't really, we're not really a democratic society if the public, if politicians don't really pay attention to public sentiment. And so it's really important how we go about identifying what, this mythical beast called the public will is, and how we go about identifying it, and how reliable our measures are. We are now a little bit more than a month out from the next presidential election. And so how do we know what's going on in this election process? Well, we know because of polling, and we'll talk a lot about polling over the next couple of classes. Right now, nationally, it appears that the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, has anywhere from a 2 to a 6 point lead in kind of averages of polls. The problem is that we don't elect presidents nationally. And so polling data doesn't really tell us much in terms of national polling. It doesn't really tell us whether, it's not predictive, in other words. It's what campaign people call it. It's indicative, not predictive. So polling can give you an idea of certain trends, and it can give you a broad sense of what the public thinks on an issue longitudinally. You can keep measuring over time. If polling is consistently stable over a long period of time, then you get a pretty clear idea that the public has a certain attitude towards a subject. For example, with abortion, the public opinion polling is pretty consistently in one direction. A majority of Americans pretty consistently support the idea of women having reproductive autonomy. Now, on the death penalty, it's different because, again, at different points in time, public sentiment fluctuates quite a bit. We go through periods where there's relatively strong majority support for the death penalty. And then there are periods when, polling support is not so strong. So today we're going to talk a little bit about public opinion and the distinction between basic values and beliefs versus attitudes and opinions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we form political opinions. So again, public opinion is defined by these ideas of basic values and beliefs. Ideally, pollsters really want to tap into what people really believe, as opposed to, what they just, this is my first blush, sort of impulse on a particular issue. Because when you're tapping into beliefs, you think you're tapping into a relatively stable, durable attitude, that a person has towards a particular subject. So again, what's the difference between values and attitudes? Public opinion, again, refers to kind of collective attitudes and opinions on issues, events, and officials. The public opinion pollsters, surveyors, they conduct polls, almost continually. And there is, a great deal of public opinion polling out there on a broad array of issues. Some of the more reputable polling firms like the Pew Research Center, Gallup, all the major newspapers conduct extensive polling. And so what they really want to know, though, is what the public really believes on any given issue. Because again, they're not doing this stuff for free, and conducting a poll is very expensive. You have to hire phone bank people, and then you have to, once you get a product, you have to be able to sell it. And what pollsters are selling is accuracy and reliability. So, again, they want to tap into that idea of what public opinion is, so that public officials have an idea. That, the one thing that as a public official you really don't want to do is to be on the wrong side of issues that really matter to the American public. That puts you at a serious disadvantage when you come up for re-election. Values reflect a person's basic political orientation, including, again, their guiding principles. Attitudes can oftentimes be first blush reactions to specific incidents. And again, where values might be resistant to revision, attitudes are oftentimes more malleable. Now, when you think in terms of polling, again, when the incumbent President Joe Biden was still in the race, a lot of pollsters were talking about a fairly coherent block of voters that they were describing as double haters. These are people who reliably said they didn't like either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And many of them were complaining, it's just a replay of the 2020 election. They want a different set of choices. Many of them were, and again, the problem is, how do you know internally what these people are complaining about? A certain percentage of those folks, we don't know exactly, were basically dead set against Donald Trump under any circumstance. A certain percentage of those folks didn't like the fact that Joe Biden was seeking an election despite the fact that he was 82 and was clearly declining in his mental acuity. And so what happened when Joe Biden got out of that race is that category effectively disappeared. And a lot of those folks that were being described by pollsters as double haters kind of moved away. Many of them moved into Kamala Harris's camp because, again, a significant proportion of those folks were basically saying, I don't like either of these guys, mainly because I think Joe Biden is too old to be president. So one of the things that pollsters really care about and are interested in identifying is the division of opinion between groups, and that can include between Democrats and Republicans, between rural versus urban Americans, between blacks and whites, between Hispanics and non-Hispanics, men and women, young and old, college educated versus non-college educated, religiously devout versus secular. These are all really important categories that they try to use, survey data to get these distinctions. This is what when we talk about stratification, pollsters are trying to figure out what are the dividing lines within the electorate on important issues. And in many instances, when you combine all these things up, you really get a sense of where people are in terms of their partisan support, politically. Ideology refers to a relatively cohesive set of beliefs that forms a general philosophy about the role of government. Now, historically, Americans were not particularly ideological. In fact, both political parties had liberal and conservative wings. And what that meant was that really well into the 1940s and 50s, both political parties had the ability to run conservative candidates in the South and liberal candidates in the Northeast, and so they were able to run candidates that were congenial to the regional subcultures that were prevalent in each of the states. What has happened over the course really of the 20th century, and it's really accelerated in the 21st century, is that you have had an ideological homogenization of the parties. They have the Republicans have kind of purged the liberals, and the Democrats have kind of purged the conservatives. So now both political parties, they have moderates within their party, but they really don't have kind of ideologically opposed groups, because the two parties have become ideological parties, where before they were what we political scientists would call catch-all parties. And with a catch-all party, again, the advantage is, you're kind of a party, you're kind of the ideological universe within each party. And that meant that in order for the party to govern, you had to reach compromise. And now what's happened is that since both political parties are ideologically kind of homogenous, kind of pure, it's very difficult for them to reach bipartisan compromises, and they don't really speak the language of the other ideological party. And so what you're really seeing is a great deal more gridlock in American politics, really beginning in the 1990s. So let's talk a little bit about what ideologies do. Ideologies typically serve four basic functions. They provide a political explanation for what's going on in society. For example, if you are a liberal, you are going to describe reality in reaction to your basic core belief, which is that individuals have rights that have to be respected and protected. Okay. The second thing is that they're going to describe reality by that basic definition. So a liberal is going to say where individuals' rights are being infringed by government, that is increasingly kind of a problem. You're also going to orient people in a particular way. Now, when you think, for example, of Marxism, Marxism is a classic ideology in the sense that it divides communities into the bourgeoisie, the people who own the means of production, and the proletariat, which are typically the workers. And so that provides a basis for sort of partisan loyalty. And then finally, ideologies provide a plan of action. Okay, so if you are an ideologue, you think, if you're an ideological, if you're a leftist, if you're a Marxist, your ideology is telling you that there needs to be a fundamental revision of the basic economy, of economic relationships, and the proletariat need to take over the means of production. Likewise, again, if you're a conservative, you're basically looking at rapid change in a critical light, and you're basically saying we need to be taking actions, we need to be applying the brakes to slowing things down, to managing the pace of change. And so ideology, I like to say that ideology is a lot like alcohol on the mind. It has a similar effect. It gives you a sense of confidence initially, but if you take in too much of it, it makes you kind of dumb and rash, and it makes you act out of character. Ideologues are typically, that is a person who is, kind of extreme, someone who, many other people find unreasonable because they're in the grip of an ideology. So in America, political values, you have this centrality of liberty, equality, and the idea of justice with an emphasis on, again, personal autonomy. We believe in freedom and justice to the extent that it is freedom for people to make their own choices in life. Large percentages of Americans strongly support freedom of expression and equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. There is strong but often theoretical support for democracy as a concept. But as democracy is actually practiced, many Americans oftentimes find that to be problematical. So you have basically sort of the provision nature of some Americans' support of basic egalitarian values. Most Americans think everyone should be treated fairly, but we disagree oftentimes vehemently over what that means. Okay? So again, when you look at the fundamental values here on this chart, it shows, again, that dark green is very, the lighter green is somewhat, and the kind of grayish is not at all. National elections should be open and fair. Close to 90% of Americans agree with that. 85% agree that rights and freedoms of all people should be respected or are respected. 85% agree that elected officials face serious consequences for misconduct. 83% judges are not influenced by political parties or elected officials. 81% agree everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. That is, again, sort of aspirational. 76% agree government is open and transparent. 75% agree a balance of power exists between governmental branches of government, between the president, Congress, and the courts. 73% agree that campaign contributions do not lead to greater political influence. I'm not sure even I agree with that. Now, when you look at these outliers, anywhere from 3 to 12% believe not at all. None of these things are actually true, right? And that really reflects a fairly durable percentage of just about every society. There is within every society a group of people who are basically just hostile to everything. They think that they're the ones that are the biggest embracers of conspiracy theories. They are the ones that are most convinced in the basic injustice of life. They're the ones that really don't like other people that much. There is just sort of a basic contempt for anything that involves other people. So American constitutionalism has contributed to dueling ideologies, to this idea that we are, on the one part a liberal society and on the other part a conservative society. Liberalism is often misunderstood theoretically. Philosophically, liberalism emerges as a coherent philosophical position in the late medieval period, early kind of modern period. And it really reflects, initially, to be liberal, even going back to ancient times, it simply meant being generous and open-handed, being someone who would help other people. In the early modern period, liberalism came to mean an emphasis on individual rights and an individual autonomy, the idea that individuals matter and should matter individually. And that had a big impact on sort of, what our ideological, kind of labels are today. The first time the word liberal was ever attached to a political position was actually in Napoleonic Spain, after Napoleon had seized Spain in the early 19th century. The liberales were the folks that wanted to expel Napoleon and form a democratic republic. So liberals and conservatives are the predominant occupants of our two major political parties. And we'll talk more about this next week. But again, to be a liberal, originally, liberalism emerged as sort of an apologia for capitalism, for the private ownership of the means of production, of factories and things like that, and private property, and for the protection of individual rights, and in particular, individual property rights. Conservatism has much deeper roots, going all the way back into the ancient world, and typically, in its base, in its kind of phonetic meaning, it simply means the preservation of the status quo. Now, there are a variety of different kinds of conservatism, including cultural conservatism, that that government should be dedicated to the preservation of culture and mores and the traditions of a society. There are religious conservatives that basically are arguing that we should move more towards a Christian view or a Muslim view or a Jewish view. They're depending on your religious adherence. Those folks are basically saying we need to be informed more by the holy doctrines than by political secular rules. There are also reactionaries who basically argue times were better in some distant past and we should take all means necessary to go back to that preferred reality. And so there's a lot of different kind of ways of interpreting conservatism. There are also a number of different ways of looking at liberalism. Obviously, traditional, laissez-faire liberalism basically just referred to minimal government involvement, especially in economic relationships. Welfarism emerges in the latter part of the 19th century, basically in reaction, in response to the rise of capitalism and industrialization. That industrialization transforms economies in ways that are damaging both to communities and also to individualism. Welfare liberalism is dedicated to the idea that government needs to act periodically to intervene in the economy and to ensure that people are protected from the worst aspects of capitalism. So you also have, again, the idea of libertarianism, which is basically liberalism pushed to its logical conclusion. And that is this idea that, basically people have rights, they have rights to autonomy, and that anything that involves intruding into those rights, be it taxation or any sort of regulation of their personal behavior, is coercion. And under libertarianism, all forms of coercion are simply wrong, are simply problematical. At the other end of the spectrum, and not really at the other end, you also have socialism. And again, democratic socialism basically stresses the use of government to achieve greater levels of equality. And again, socialists make the argument that society is not innately fair, that many people are simply born with more resources than other people, and that government needs to intervene in ways that make sure that people have equal access to resources. And this is where you get the idea of equality of outcomes, where there is, like a minimum salary you can make, or there is a use of taxation to minimize how much a person can earn. In many socialist societies, they advocate a 100% tax bracket, where if you earn more than, I'll just throw out a number, if you earn more than, say, $1 million a year, the government then takes every penny off of that. America's ideological spectrum has historically been far more compressed to what I would consider, sort of a welfare liberalism on the left to a religious conservatism on the right. What has happened over the last, generation or so is that our ideological spectrum has expanded. There are a lot more social democrats walking around, to the extent that, for example, Bernie Sanders, who describes himself as a social democrat, could get elected to a statewide office in Vermont, which is, again, a very small state. But again, that's you didn't see that too often. In the 1930s, Vermont was a rock-ribbed Republican state, and now it's as blue, a deep blue, a liberal state as you could find. Likewise, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez self-describes as a democratic socialist. So you're seeing more and more people elected elected to federal office that are not really liberal. And you are also seeing an increasing number of people on the right who really are further right than most people than many people are comfortable with, and that likely would not have been elected in previous times. So again, our ideological spectrum has broadened, and not always in ways that are comfortable for people in the middle spectrum of American politics. Most Americans identify either as liberal, conservative, or as moderate. And moderate is a very large category. Now, what does it mean to be a moderate? In many instances, moderates and independents, first of all, there's a sort of myth surrounding that. The idea of moderation is oftentimes that a person might be liberal on some issues, but might also be very conservative on others. And so, you have that. There are many moderates who simply are apolitical. They are uncomfortable with politics. Politics either confuses them or makes them uncomfortable. And so they simply don't think about it that much. And so very often what you're seeing are people, who describe themselves as moderate, who basically say, well, I haven't really thought that much about these issues. The reality of many moderates is that they are simply middle of the road on a lot of different issues. They can see both sides of an issue. And then there is also, again, the reality. Most independent voters who are often describe themselves as moderate, on 70% of occasions where they vote, they will vote with one party or the other. And I will give you two examples. In Massachusetts, independent voters actually outnumber Republicans and Democrats. I want to say that Republicans are only about a little bit less than a fifth of the registered voters, and Democrats are a little bit less than a quarter. Nevertheless, it is a deep blue state, and many of those independents, 75% of the time or more, will vote, will support Democratic candidates. The distinction is that they will also periodically vote for a moderate Republican. Massachusetts elected Mitt Romney governor. More recently, they elected Charlie Baker governor. These are, again, Republicans who are in the moderate spectrum, who basically say, look, I can balance out the worst implications of this rampant liberalism that's going on in Massachusetts, and I can kind of hold the state legislature accountable. In contrast, in Oklahoma, there are, again, a lot of independent voters. There are more Republican registered voters than there are Democrats by a considerable margin. I want to say it's close to a majority. But there are a considerable number of independent voters. Once again, though, those independent voters oftentimes vote with Republicans. So region where independent voters can be located is oftentimes an important determinant of where they're going to actually fall down when they walk into a polling booth. So again, if you look at this graph of American ideology, it tracks pretty consistently, right? Anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of Americans identify as liberal. Anywhere from a third to a little bit more than a third, 36% or so, are going to identify as conservative. And now a little bit, around 37% identify as moderate. And again, that reflects many Americans' ambivalence, and the fact that more and more, as ideology is getting packed into our political parties, people who kind of see both sides of the equation are feeling more and more uncomfortable with self-identifying as either a Democrat or a Republican, or for that matter, as a liberal or a conservative. So how do we go about forming political opinions? There are a number of basic forces at play that shape us and turn us into who we are. Our culture, our history, our educational systems, our family, the religion that we choose to adopt or not. These are all things that will have an impact on the kind of American that we become. And there are a lot of different kind of flavors of American, if you will. So human beings are socialized into specific political cultures and also into subcultures. So when you think about it now, for example, I was born in the Deep South, which should say something about my political socialization, but I was also born on a military installation. I was born in what is now Fort Moore, Georgia, which is the largest military installation east of the Mississippi. And again, I also moved around quite a bit. My father moved back to then Fort Benning, and retired there. And when my dad retired, we moved to Columbus, which is a town right next to Fort Benning, right to the north of Fort Benning. But I was raised on military installations, and I was raised in with a family of 4. I'm the youngest. We lived in Germany for a time. We lived in Virginia for a time. We lived with my grandparents, my father's grandparents, for a time in Texas when my dad was serving in Vietnam. And then ultimately we went back to Fort Benning. Now, think about that from my perspective. I was not really a Southerner because in a practical sense, I was living on a military installation surrounded by people who were a microcosm of the United States. I had neighbors who were from California. We lived right next door to the Canadian Liaisons office, which meant that there was an officer, a Canadian officer, there. We went through two or three families in the time that we were there. And so I was exposed to a lot more in terms of subcultures than your typical Southern kid who was raised in Southern Georgia in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And so socialization refers to this process of learning underlying beliefs and values on which a political system is based. And so, again, from my perspective, again, my parents, my mom is from a suburb south of Boston. She's from Massachusetts. My father is from West Texas. And so, again, you had, different cultural exemplars within my family, which, one of the interesting things about being a military brat, as they call children who were born and raised in the military, we get pretty adaptable because every 18 months you're dealing either with a new environment or you're dealing with new friends because your friends' parents have been reassigned, because every 18 months in the military you're subject to reassign, or every 36 months sometimes. Okay. So agents of socialization work on us and help mold us into the people that we become. And so lived experience has a powerful effect on us. And again, as a child of I was born in 1963, you can do the math. I lived on a military base through Vietnam. When my dad retired, we ended up living in South Georgia again in the 1970s at a time when there was a great deal of social conflict due to desegregation. And so, there's a lot of lived experience that affects how I view the world. So friends and families, first and foremost, are your first agent of socialization. You're going to learn the language that you're going to learn. Ironically, it's funny, the first language, I kind of started learning English, but then we moved to Germany, and I was left alone. My mom worked at a hospital. Both my parents were nurse anesthetists. So my mom worked at a hospital, and my dad was a nurse anesthetist as well. And so I was left alone with a German maid who only spoke German. And so I picked up German quicker than my siblings who were going to base school, where English was predominantly spoken. The only person I could communicate was a German speaker. And so I actually was bilingual when I was 5 years old for a brief period of time. So your parents are going to teach you a language. They're going to teach you values. You're going to, respect your father and your mother based on their mutual interactions. I oftentimes tell people that one of the worst things that can happen to a child is to be raised within a family that doesn't read. If your parents are avid readers, you will become an effective reader. If your parents don't read, you oftentimes, it's a very difficult process teaching a child the utility of reading. And so a child can become functionally literate but not really be an effective reader because they don't really see the utility. It's just words on a page. And until and unless you understand sort of the joys of reading, how reading can activate your imagination in powerful ways, then you really don't get a sense of how important reading is as an imaginative exercise. Partisan preferences are often shaped in the home. For example, again, both my parents were Army officers. My mom was forced to retire when she became pregnant with my older brother. That was how they did things in the 1950s in the military. But my dad was, he was a West Texan, and he was also a military officer. As an officer, he was bound by the Hatch Act, which we'll talk more on later. But the Hatch Act basically bans, partisanship within government employees. And as an officer, my father was kind of legally barred from having legal opinions. He was also, again, a member, an officer in the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army has very strong cultural mores against hyperpartisanship. And so, there really wasn't a lot of partisan talk in my household. Shop talk in my parents' household was, talking about what happened in the emergency room that day, or what kinds of operations my mom participated in, which is part of the reason why I did not go into medicine. Another thing that can happen, parents can, be partisan and can try to program their children and socialize their children to follow their political beliefs. I can tell you, social science research suggests that is rarely effective. Sometimes it works very well, and conservative parents are able to reproduce very conservative children. But very often, children rebel against either being compelled to be liberal or conservative. And so the more you try to tell your children what sorts of basic beliefs they should have, children instinctively understand, and it is part of what cultural anthropologists and sociologists call individuation, where you find your own individual identity. And the more you stress certain things, oftentimes the more a child will individuate against that particular ideology that you are trying to instill within them. Oftentimes, children raised in mixed partisan households may demonstrate increased political tolerance. For example, again, in my household, my mom was opposed to my dad going to Vietnam. She did not believe that it was a good war. But he went because he was ordered. He followed his orders. And, again, that reflects a basic kind of, their cultural differences. And so, part of the reason I think why I am a fairly tolerant individual is that I was raised in a household where, one parent was fairly doctrinaire and conservative, and another parent was relatively liberal. The friends you make and the social networks you form are going to have a powerful socializing effect. A lot of times, again, kids that do take an interest in politics will be attracted to other people who are interested in politics, oftentimes to argue with them, right? Sometimes, again, you can have these kind of cross-partisan, friendships form because it's more interesting to argue with people that disagree with you. People that agree with you on everything, that can be pretty boring. At the same time, people that disagree with you passionately and express beliefs that you find abhorrent can produce a real strain on a relationship. Education. Public education is a vital source of education, of sort of socialization in the United States. For much of our history, well into the late 19th century, education was primarily a local government thing. Local governments built schools. They were oftentimes these single room, classrooms. As again, what changes? You get more population. You get, more. You need to have more organization. As education, again, as the economy becomes more complex, people entering the workforce have to have a greater skill set than simply reading, writing, and arithmetic. And most importantly, America's commitment to public education was transformed by the late 19th and early 20th century wave of non-English speaking immigrants. That produced a serious investment and commitment to public education, because the recognition was that we needed to socialize young children who were not being raised in American households per se into what it means to be American. Okay, and so that was one of the most effective socializing tools. And one thing, again, that social science has taught us, oftentimes an Italian immigrant would come over. They may never, learn English, but their children would, because they're going to public schools. And oftentimes, very quickly, those children become sort of the interpreter for the outside world for those parents. Those parents, an Italian might be a bricklayer or a fisherman or something like that, not really interact with many, English-speaking Americans. But they get mail, they get bills, they get things like that. And the children are able to tell them what they are and what their responsibilities are. Which is fundamentally reflects to me the tragedy of why public education has become so controversial. In part because a significant portion of the American public has gone in a nativist direction, that believe in America only for Americans. They reject the premise of America as a nation of refugees, a nation of immigrants, which was sort of our great strength, right? The great poem on the Statue of Liberty. We take the wretched refuse of the world and make them Americans. Differences in formal educational attainment are oftentimes strongly correlated with different political orientations. For much, again, of American history, working class Americans who lacked a college education were oftentimes strong Democrats. That has shifted significantly, in particular among rural, non-college educated Americans. People that were once some of the strongest Democrats are now some of the most partisan Republicans. You can see that in this state, where again, if you look at a red versus blue map, with red being Republican and blue being Democrat, there were only a few areas of red in Oklahoma in the 1930 presidential elections. Just about everything was blue. What happened over the course into the 1980s, by the time you get to the 1990s, that really shifts, and all these sparsely populated, there are 77 counties in Oklahoma. Most of them turned gradually red, from pink to red over the course of the 1990s. By the time you get into the 21st century, those sparsely populated rural counties are now deep red. And increasingly, the three largest counties are tinging light blue. Cleveland County, which is part of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma County, also part of Oklahoma City, and Tulsa County are the three largest counties in Oklahoma. They are increasingly becoming more competitive. They are beginning to send more and more Democrats to state government, to state legislature. So it's important to keep in mind that education doesn't necessarily turn you into a liberal. In a lot of instances, what's going on there are multiple factors. People with college educations are oftentimes moving to large cities in order to find a job that fits with their education. They're often, again, large cities require greater levels of government. Most larger, densely populated cities are, frankly, Democratic because people there recognize they need more in the way of government services. Cities require more government. Dense populations require more interventions by government. Another important thing to keep in mind is that a college education increases political efficacy, that sense in which you actually believe that you matter, right? It improves your critical thinking skills so that you can identify which politicians are actually serving your interests as opposed to, some narrow set of interests. Basically, it supports the idea of an evidence-based approach to citizenship, right? Do tax cuts always work, to the benefit of the public as a whole? As a college-educated person, you can actually do some research and identify. Donald Trump has predicated his entire presidential campaign on the idea that raising tariffs across the board is going to be a panacea for American economic growth. Well, history suggests that tariffs simply cause trade wars and that they actually raise the cost of imported goods. And if you don't understand the extent to which America's economy is running on imported goods, it's going to raise taxes on day-to-day Americans, because in most instances the importers are going to pass those costs along to consumers. And in fact, one of the kind of provoking events of the Great Depression was Congress passing what was known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the late 1930s, which again provoked a trade war, impeded the free trade, the free flow of trade, and contributed to the Great Depression. Social groups and public opinion. Social groupings include aspects of identity not subject to choice, including things like sex, age, racial groups. I don't have a choice about my age. I can dress a certain way. I can act, I can try to act younger, but at some point I am my age, right? I don't have a choice about the racial group that I come from. I am an Irish, American. I'm a mutt. I have a lot of different ethnic, DNA flowing through my veins, but predominantly I am a Northern European in terms of DNA. Social groupings also include, aspects of your identity that you affirmatively select. People's identity is oftentimes subject to creative selection. We've seen an explosion of people experimenting with different gender designations. The very idea that you are queer means that you don't feel comfortable identifying as a male or a female. And I think that kind of experimentation is not a bad thing. I think that is a natural part of people's process of how they become individuals. People's religious convictions will have a strong effect on their identity. I have an older sister. She and I both went to college. We both got college degrees. We both went to graduate school at the same place. We both went to the University of South Carolina. She got a master's degree in speech language pathology. She then moved to Southern Virginia, where she fell in love with a nice guy who I love very much, who happened to be the son of a Baptist minister. And she embraced that community and the political values that come with being a Southern Baptist. That particular church was strongly associated with the moral majority, and so she kind of overnight became a lot more conservative than she had been before she moved to take that first fateful job after school in Southern Virginia. So it's important to keep in mind that religion can have an effect on a person's identity. Choosing to be a secular American will have an effect on your belief system and on your subsequent your subsequent political orientation. Likewise, becoming a member of certain groups is going to have an effect on your political outlook, whether you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. Lawyers they span the ideological spectrum, but depending on the kind of law you practice, people who are trial lawyers are far more likely to be liberals and to become Democrats than people who work in corporate law, who are far more likely to become conservatives or Republicans, or for that matter, people who become prosecutors, who are, again, kind of schizophrenic. A lot of them are, the vast majority of people who are drawn to the prosecutorial aspect of the law are law and order conservatives. But there are a lot of people, many of them are minorities, and also some social liberals who become prosecutors because they believe that the law has been used in inappropriate ways, in ways that reinforce injustice. And so they have brought those sensibilities into those jobs, in many instances in controversial ways. From my perspective, again, becoming a political scientist, we have a strong emphasis on, kind of not being ideological. I actually teach a class in ideology. I think, your political viewpoints are your own, and you have a right to them. At the same time, people who are drawn to political science, first and foremost, have a belief that government and public policy can be a force for good in people's lives. That has ideological implications to them. Now, I will tell you, there are plenty of conservative political scientists, but a majority of political scientists are, in fact, probably liberal. Now, most of us also register as independents because we don't necessarily want people to think that we side with one side or another in how we teach our subjects. Race, again, has an important kind of influence on people's partisan beliefs, particularly among racial groupings that have historically been subject to discrimination. As we learned last week in our discussion of civil rights, blacks, of course, were treated as chattel property. They were denied their basic humanity for centuries prior to becoming, to being legally released by the Civil War amendments, by the 13th Amendment. At the same time, they were then subjected to political subjugation and denied their social and their social dignity and their political rights for more decades. And so that has a profound impact on how people view. Strong majorities, probably upwards of 2/3 of blacks and Hispanics and Asian Americans, have this idea of what is known as a linked fate. They do not look at themselves simply as individual Americans, but as Black Americans, as Hispanic Americans, as Asian Americans, because they have, as a group, been denied their legal rights. And so they are oftentimes more inclined to vote for the political party that seems to be transactionally willing to protect their rights. And that has historically, certainly in the last few decades, been the Democratic Party. Blacks routinely vote more than 80% for Democratic candidates. In part, that's also because in the Deep South, that's where a large percentage of Black Americans live these days, and they look at at Republicans as working against their interests, again, because of that history of discrimination and because of the present, where Republicans routinely attempt to pass laws that suppress blacks' ability to vote. And so when as a matter of, just when your instinct is to say, I don't want everybody from that group to be participating, that group is going to identify in opposition to your political program. And it's not accidental that when you look at the states of the former Confederacy, it shouldn't be a shock to anyone that 90% of whites vote for Republicans in Mississippi and 90% of blacks vote for Democrats. Okay? So when people say that we are a post-racial society, I laugh in their face. That is a ridiculous statement. Racism continues to drive our politics, and we can debate the best ways to reach this post-racial world where we genuinely do listen to Martin Luther King and judge people on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. But we're not there now, and we haven't been. And much of our politics, much of the polarization that is informing our politics is a result of racial animus. It remains a problem. And as a result of this continuing, kind of diametrically opposed views. Blacks and non-blacks have fundamentally different, viewpoints on police, things like police-involved violence or occupational opportunities. Whites, routinely will say, "Oh yeah, blacks have an equal opportunity. In fact, they've got it better than me as a white guy." And again, that is oftentimes a ridiculous statement. So one of the things that I think I mentioned in the last presentations on civil rights was that, it was, from a social scientific perspective, very interesting to look at the composition of the Black Lives Matter marches of the summer of 2020, because it was not just blacks. It was a much larger grouping of younger, oftentimes again outgroups of Americans who do not necessarily identify with mainstream Americanism that were joining those marches. And that reflects this sense in which there are more and more people that are acknowledging the realities of racism in America. I read an article recently in the Washington Post on Korean Americans, and oftentimes again, Korean Americans are, and Asian Americans broadly. It was about Korea. It was about Asian Americans in Georgia, which are increasingly becoming a very consequential voting bloc. And what you find is that the Korean churches, many Korean Americans that came to the United States, Korean immigrants, were also evangelical Christians. Not surprisingly, evangelical Korean churches are deeply conservative and identify with the Republican Party. But many younger Koreans are, again, increasingly flowing towards the Democratic Party because of the Trump era, racial animus that Donald Trump routinely expressed in public statements about immigrants specifically. And there was a specific instance where a white Georgian went on a multi-community killing spree and killed 6 specifically Asian American women in massage parlors. He claimed he had some kind of sex addiction, but within the Asian community in Georgia, that was perceived as a hate crime aimed at them. And that had a galvanizing effect on their political orientation. And so you're seeing a significant uptick in both participation among Asian Americans in Georgia and also elsewhere. And they are oftentimes younger Asian Americans, and they are running oftentimes as Democrats. So again, this slide really again shows you the disparity in perception in how race is perceived. So again, the dark green are black respondents, and the lighter green are white respondents. And this is percentages of people saying black people are treated less fairly than white people in various situations, including by the criminal justice system. And again, you're seeing a majority of American whites accept, blacks are treated unfairly. And again, in dealing with police, they accept, 60% of Americans accept that blacks are treated differently when they're stopped by police. In hiring, pay, and promotions, there, again, when it addresses an economic dimension, it drops to 44%. And that 44% are probably, for the most part, liberals. And then when applying for jobs or a mortgage, it goes down again to 38% of whites, where again, 74% of blacks are saying, I've experienced difficulty getting a loan or getting a mortgage. And again, that is informed by history, okay? Being treated differently in stores or restaurants, where you go to sit down in a restaurant as a black man with your family, and the waitresses just ignore you and pretend that that they're not assigned to your table for an hour or more. That happens in certain restaurants.
when seeking medical treatment. Now again, that's declining. Only about 59% of blacks think that still happens, but there's a history of it. And then it goes down to 37 or 26% of whites. And again, they're not seeing that, therefore, now that can't be true, right? But it does happen periodically. And again, when voting in elections, and again, nearly 60% of blacks believe and probably have some experience of having difficulty voting because of efforts at the state level to make it harder for blacks to vote than they do for whites. And again, that's only about 30% of whites that acknowledge that. And again, that's typically going to be liberal whites that maybe have learned and read about these kinds of circumstances. And again, this is something that's important to keep in mind with polling. Oftentimes, if people haven't done research on a particular issue, and if you're a white working class guy and you don't read the newspaper, periodically, and get most of your news from social media, you're less likely to think that there is this systematic effort to make it harder for blacks to vote. And so you'll impulsively say, no, we're fair. We're a fair society. They have the same shot that we do. Okay? Ethnicity, again, generates very different political attitudes. It's important to keep in mind that when you're talking, for example, about Latinos, they comprise nearly 20% of the electorate today, but it's the Latino perspective is very complex, okay? And their voting preferences vary considerably. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans tend to support Democrats, while Cuban Americans and Venezuela Americans tend to support Republicans. Oftentimes, Latino communities will reflect the viewpoints of the communities that they live in. It is a way of fitting in. You oftentimes find this among Asian Americans, where, especially among Vietnamese, they settled along the coasts because many of them wanted to work, as fishermen. And they're in these very conservative coastal communities on the coast, and naturally their impulses are going to be towards identifying with Republicans. Both Hispanics and Asian Americans, oftentimes their experiences in their home country will affect their perspectives. Among Vietnamese, their experience with the Communist Party. Among Venezuelan, their experience with Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's authoritarian leftist governments leaves a taste in their mouth, and it affects their perspective. And they look at the Democratic Party and say, they're more socialist than Republicans. I don't want to have anything to do with them. Gender, again, has a powerful effect on people's attitudes. Differing roles create different kind of gender differences. Women are more likely to oppose military interventions than men, and are more likely to favor gun control measures and social welfare programs, because in many instances, women become mothers and they become very concerned about their children and being safe in schools with all the school shootings. Naturally, they're worried about their kids growing up, maybe going into the military. They want to make sure that the military, if their son becomes a soldier, that they're fighting it for a good cause. Okay, this creates what is known as the gender gap, and that is this tendency for women to support Democratic candidates at much higher rates than they do Republicans, and vice versa. Republicans tend to support Republicans at slightly higher rates. To some extent, ethnicity reflects this as well. Again, black women, Asian women, Native American women, oftentimes again have that added identity issue that makes them more likely to support the political party that's going to be in favor of civil rights, in favor of welfare rights, and things like that. Another important question is this idea of the glass ceiling, both in politics and in business. It's very difficult for women to rise to leadership positions. We have never had a woman president. There is the possibility, kind of a 50-50 possibility, that Kamala Harris will be the first woman elected president of the United States. It's telling that this would be the first time in the 21st century where there have been African countries that have elected women leaders of their country. It's very difficult for women to rise to CEO positions of major corporations. It's very difficult for women to rise to general rank within the military. It's very difficult for women, again, why have we not had a woman president yet? Because it's very difficult to win a statewide election. And when you think about it, again, you have to, where can you run for president from? You have to be, Donald Trump is the first really businessman, person who never held political office to be elected president. Most people who have been elected president were either senators or governors or vice presidents or generals, military heroes. Those are kind of the four broad categories. And there haven't been very many women, senators or governors. Kamala Harris will have a series of firsts. She was the first female vice president. She'd also be the first she was the first black president. She was the first Indian American, first South Asian American vice president. She would be a first in all of those categories. Religion is an important part of political socialization. America was conceived as a religiously diverse society. One of the main aspects of the First Amendment is, again, that idea of the Establishment Clause, which preserves the idea of religious pluralism, that the United States would not be simply a Protestant country, that it would be an Episcopalian country, that it would be a Catholic country, that it would be a Methodist country, a Lutheran country, a Baptist country, a Quaker country. However, one thing that is changing is that today nearly 1/3 of Americans identify as secular, of not belonging to any particular organized religion. Oftentimes within American politics, the intensity of religious belief correlates strongly with partisanship. So, and this crosses religious creed as well. Strong Catholics, people who live their lives around their Catholic faith, are far more likely to identify as conservative and far more likely to vote Republican. Very Orthodox Jews who are very conservative in their religious devotions are oftentimes self-identify as conservative and vote for Republicans. People who are people who are more secular, less intense in their religious beliefs, oftentimes are more likely to vote for Democrats. So again, the main problem, the main challenge, and again, this is something that we talked about in our civil rights, or actually our discussion of constitutional rights of civil liberties, is that religion creates challenges for public education. Because the more Americans want a particular religion to be the basis for public education, the more you end up indoctrinating kids that don't belong to that particular religious identity. And so the more you entangle public education and public tax dollars in the educational process, the more controversy you invite. Party affiliation, Americans oftentimes see America, see politics through red or blue tinted glasses. This has increasingly given rise to what we describe as partisan polarization, where people who strongly identify as Democrats or Republicans, they fundamentally disagree and have a sense of animus towards people who are members of the other party. So if you are a self-identified Democrat, you don't simply think that, oh, well, those guys are on the other team. They have a right to their view. You think those people are bad faith and they are acting in ways that are contrary to what is best for America. And that is a dangerous kind of partisanship. And what has also happened over the course of the late 20th and into the early 20th century, beginning really in the 1990s, maybe even a little bit earlier, is that more and more Americans live in what we describe as partisan bubbles. As you know, they live in Fox world. They turn on Fox News in the morning and they turn it off at night. And everything, all the news they get is a particular whatever product that Fox News is producing. And likewise, many folks just turn on MSNBC and that's all they listen to. Many Americans are getting their news from social media, and the algorithms are pulling them in a more partisan direction. And if you don't know, algorithms are simply the code that is written for Facebook and for Twitter that says give the person what they want. And if you're watching, or also with YouTube, if you're watching greatest knockouts on, the boxing knockouts, the more you watch those videos, the more violent the imagery will get for you. The more political stuff you watch on YouTube, the more politics you'll get in your feed. And they will identify your partisan preferences, and they will give you more and more stuff that you already agree with. And so that creates a choir effect, which can be very, very, again, damaging to democracy. Because again, it doesn't simply mean that we're competing. It means that we want to eradicate the other side. We want to live in our own little bubble, and we want our bubble to expand to encompass everybody else. Economic class is an important basis for how people believe. Economic self-interest oftentimes influences people's political opinions. Americans widely agree that income inequality is a problem, but there are huge disagreements, again, about what to do with that problem. So wealth and the lack of wealth has a profound impact on people, oftentimes for the worst. The very wealthy become entitled. They think they can use other people as ends because they're wealthy, because they think that their wealth implies that or means that they are better than other people. Likewise, great poverty traps people within a culture of poverty that induces short-term thinking, that induces a kind of amoral familialism where I take care of mine and I don't care if selling drugs to my neighbors is how I do it, right? If violence is how I have to get away, get ahead in life, then that's what I'm going to do. So great wealth and great poverty are in many ways equally deranging of people, okay? The last thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of region. Region of the country oftentimes has a subculture. And so when you look at the different subcultures, the Deep South is probably the most authoritarian-oriented subculture in American culture. It is oriented in a highly, hierarchical manner, deeply religious. There are oftentimes profound, personalistic ideas of honor that contribute to violence. And of course, there is tremendous racial tension in those areas. One of our vice presidential nominees is from, Appalachia, or a part, near Appalachia. He wrote, J.D. Vance wrote the book Hillbilly Elegy, which again it's a reflection on poverty and what to do about it. Many of these other areas, the Rocky Mountain states, the Columbia Plateau, these are more libertarian areas, again, where people believe in self-sufficiency and in basically taking care of yourself. When you look at these coastal areas, these are areas that are far more liberal, again, because they're far more densely populated, and also they're on the coasts where there are bad things that happen. When you look at what happened in Florida and up into North Carolina with the flooding from Helene, you get an idea. There have to be a collective response to these kinds of challenges. All right, so that's it for today. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of public opinion. In particular, we'll talk about how to measure it and what are the challenges to accurately measuring public sentiment. I'll see you next time.